trying to do one of these where is or who is books in my Viewer's Choice yearly series. This topic was chosen by Canopy Book Club, who really wanted something about the Seven Summits, which my library didn't have any books on the Seven Summits. So I read this book, and it's actually really good. I actually learned like a lot about Mount Everest in this book, so I can't wait to read it too. But I thought, why don't we just very briefly talk about the Seven Summits with my new unveiling for the first time on the channel, my handy dandy laminated world map. So the Seven Summits are supposed to be the 7 highest mountains on each continent. So I'll start off by telling you the traditional 7 summits. For North America, we have Denali up here, which my map still calls it Mount McKinley. It's been renamed to Denali. In South America, we have Aconcagua right here. In Europe, it's not marked because Europe's really busy, but it's right about here. And it's Mont Blanc. Let's write it. Mont Blanc. Down here is Mount Kilimanjaro. Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. Then, of course, we have Mount Everest right there. In Australia, we have Mount Kosciuszko. Mount Kosciuszko. And just south of my map, like right down here, is Mount Vinson in Antarctica. So these are the traditional 7 summits, but there's a bit of a dispute. In Europe, technically, the tallest mountain in Europe is right here, and it is Mount Elbrus. Mount Elbrus, I promise it's an E. Mount Elbrus. Technically, that's the highest mountain in Europe, but it's in the Caucasus in western Russia, which is technically part of Europe, but it gets overlooked. So traditional Europe, the tallest mountain is Mont Blanc, but technically it's Mount Elbrus. The tallest mountain on the continent of Australia is Mount Kosciuszko. But if we're talking Oceania, the tallest would be Mount Cook or Aoraki here in New Zealand. But if you count the island of New Guinea as Oceania, some people do, it's debatable, it would be right here, and that is Puncak Jaya. Like me, I consider Papua New Guinea Oceania, but not Indonesia New Guinea, personally. But it's right in there, so debatable, right? Also, the tallest mountain in the world, if you're measuring from seafloor to the tippy top, is in Hawaii. It is Mauna Kea, and it's way bigger than Mount Everest if you measure it from the very, 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 very bottom of it under the ocean. There's also Mount Chimborazo right here, Chimborazo, which, because it's right next to the equator, it is technically the nearest mountain to space. Because the Earth isn't a perfect sphere, it's a little bit squished, so in the middle, it's higher up than other parts of the world. So, there's that. All the little discrepancies there. So, the 7 summits. It is actually much larger than 7, I suppose. So let me just erase all this real quick. Erasing Mount Vincent. Sorry, Mount Vincent. Erasing Mont Blanc, Mount Elbrus. This goes Everest, we're going to read about tonight. Puncak Jaya, Kosciuszko, and Mount Cook. Alright. I hope you enjoy my little map. I've been trying to figure out how to use it on my channel. For stuff like that, at least. Alright. So let's read more in detail about the highest of all of these mountains, if you don't count Mauna Kea and Mount Chimborazo. Everest. Let's get started. Where is Mount Everest? I mean, I just showed you, but where's Mount Everest? April 18th, 2014 was the deadliest day in the history of Mount Everest. Standing on the border between Nepal and China, this mammoth mountain rises more than 29,000 feet, nearly 5.5 miles into the sky. It is the highest point on Earth. More than 4,000 people have reached the top of Everest. Hundreds more have died trying. Early that morning in 2014, around 50 men were on the mountain. Suddenly, a block of ice the size of a house broke off a cliff. It cracked into truck-sized pieces. The ice chunks tumbled down the mountainside, instantly killing those in its path. For days, people dug into the snow and ice, hoping to find survivors, but in the end, 16 men lost their lives. Most of the men on the mountain that day were Sherpas, the native people of the area. To the Sherpas, Everest is known as Chomolungma. That means Mother Goddess of the World. They revere and respect her. On that fateful Friday morning, Chomolungma reminded them and the world of the mountain's savage power. Every year, hundreds of people from around the world try to reach the summit of Mount Everest. Many of these adventure seekers pay Sherpas to be their guides. This is how a lot of Sherpas make a living. But climbing Everest can be a dangerous business. Avalanches, fast-moving walls of snow are common. Violent snowstorms appear out of nowhere. Hurricane-force winds make the sub-zero temperatures feel even colder. The frozen ground beneath your feet can split open, revealing cracks more than 100 feet deep. Near the summit, there's an area known as the death zone. The air is so thin, so lacking in oxygen that you can hardly breathe. No life exists at the top of Everest. Humans who reach the top must turn around and climb back down right away. If not, they face certain death. But despite these many dangers, climbers come back year after year. It's natural to wonder why someone would take such risk for a chance to stand on top of a mountain. Different people have different reasons, but when one mountaineer was asked why he wished to climb Mount Everest, his answer was simple: because it's there. Chapter 1: Birth of a Mountain. The Himalayan mountain range, home to Mount Everest, stretches more than 1,500 miles across Asia. It runs from Pakistan through Bhutan. The Himalayas rise higher than any other mountains in the world by a long shot. More than 100 Himalayan peaks are over 24,000 feet above sea level. Mount Aconcagua in South America is the tallest mountain outside Asia. It stands at 22,841 feet. That is more than a mile shorter than Mount Everest. Despite Everest's height, fossils of prehistoric sea creatures can be found near the top. That's because millions of years ago, the rocks that would later become the Himalayas lay at the bottom of an ancient ocean. Plate tectonics, the movement of large sections of the Earth's crust and upper mantle, gave rise to these great mountains. Years ago, there was no Asia or Africa, no North or South America. This is because all the land on Earth was part of a single supercontinent that we now call Pangaea. About 200 million years ago, Pangaea began to break apart. When this happened, India became an island. 80 million years ago, when dinosaurs still walked the Earth, India began to drift toward what is now Asia. India was moving quickly, about 4 inches per year. That is more than twice as fast as human fingernails grow. Year by year, the sea between the two land masses grew smaller and smaller. After 30 million years, the sea had disappeared altogether, and India crashed into Asia. The seafloor folded up on itself. It began to push toward the sky. In another 25 million years, the Himalayas were born. When the rock could fold no further, it broke and sunk down toward the Earth's mantle. Here, at temperatures of more than 4,000 degrees, the rock melted and flowed away. This made room for more rock to sink and melt. As melted rock floated back toward the surface, it cooled and hardened. This put pressure on the young mountains above it, pushing them even higher. This mountain building process continues today. India continues to push under Asia, and Mount Everest grows a little bit every year. Himalaya means snow home in the ancient Indian language of Sanskrit. The Himalayas are so tall they are covered in snow and glaciers year-round. Mount Everest is sometimes called the third pole. Only the north and south poles contain more snow than the Himalayas. When Himalayan snow melts, it feeds great rivers, the Ganges, Indus, Yangtze, Mekong, and others. From Afghanistan to Thailand, these rivers provide water for more than 1 billion people, 1 out of every 5 people in the world. The Himalayas also affect the weather in the region. Every summer, warm, wet winds blow north from the Indian Ocean. When these winds reach the Himalayas, they rise upward, forming rain clouds. The rains fall hard over India in the summer months, watering crops and swelling rivers. High in the mountains, the rain falls as snow and ice. This weather pattern is known as the monsoon. Without the Himalayas to block them, the warm winds would simply blow into China and Russia, and the monsoon rains would not fall. Cherrapunji is a town in India 325 miles east of Mount Everest. It is often said to be the wettest place on Earth. Every year it gets more than 450 inches of rainfall. That's more than 10 times the amount of rain that falls in Seattle, Washington, a city known for rainy days. The mountains also keep India warm, blocking out cold Arctic winds from the north. Indeed, people in many areas across Asia, from the highlands of Nepal to the jungles of Myanmar, depend on these magnificent mountains for life itself. Chapter 2: The People of Everest. People have lived in the Himalayas for thousands of years, but the Khumbu Valley, the high and rugged area surrounding Mount Everest, was settled only 500 years ago by the Sherpa people. They came from south-central Tibet. That's a region in China on the north side of the Himalayas, which we're not going to get into today. That's a whole thing. Tibetan people knew about the Khumbu Valley for years before it was settled. A few visited the beautiful wilderness to be at peace with their thoughts, but it was not until 1533 that the first settlers, a group of between 25 and 50 Sherpas on horseback, arrived in Khumbu and stayed. They were hunter-gatherers, foraging for wild mushrooms and bamboo shoots to eat. They lived in caves and bamboo huts. Eventually villages were built, and terraces were carved out of the mountainsides for planting wheat and barley. As they still do to this day, the Sherpas raised long-haired oxen called yaks. Yaks have small hooves with sharp edges that give them control in difficult and slippery terrain, much like mountaineers' climbing tools. The Sherpas use them to carry heavy loads. Meat, milk, butter, wool, leather, and fertilizer come from yaks. Because of the extremely rough land, there are no roads in the Khumbu Valley. Even the use of wagons and wheelbarrows is difficult, so yaks are still used for travel. Along steep and narrow mountain paths, the yaks climb the 19,000-foot-high Nangpa Pass, loaded down with Sherpa goods, and return with salt from Tibet. Whatever loads are not carried by yaks are carried by the Sherpas themselves. Known for their strength, Sherpa guides can carry loads of up to 100 pounds on their backs. The religion of the Sherpa people is a form of Buddhism in which many deities or gods and goddesses exist. The Sherpas also believe in demons. Their gods can protect people from these demons. In return return, the gods must be respected and provided with offerings. Until Westerners began visiting the Khumbu Valley in the 20th century, the Sherpas had never climbed Mount Everest. It was considered taboo, forbidden. They believed the mountain was sacred. It was the home of gods and demons. Although they climb Everest today, Sherpas are still very respectful of Chomolungma. They do not want to anger the mother goddess. They do not even like to curse on the mountain. Before any trip to the top of Everest, a ceremony is performed in front of a stone altar. It is conducted by a spiritual leader or lama. During the ceremony, the gods are asked to protect the climbers. The climbing equipment is also blessed. Offerings such as fruits and chocolate are placed on the altar, and fragrant juniper leaves are burned. Prayer flags, colorful pieces of cloth with prayers written on them, are strung up. Sherpas believe that the wind lets loose spiritual energy within the flags, sending blessings of peace and love across the land. These prayer flags can be found at the top of the mountain too, and all around the Khumbu Valley. Jordans can also be found on mountain trails leading up to Everest. These small stone shrines may contain offerings or smaller mani stones, tablets engraved with prayers. Sometimes prayer flags are found on them. Houses of worship called monasteries also dot the landscape around Mount Everest. The largest and most famous of these is Tengpoche. It is known for its beauty and its sweeping views of Mount Everest and the Himalayas. Tengpoche is surrounded by mani stones. Prayer flags in 5 colors flutter in the wind. Thousands of visitors come to Tengpoche every year. Many come to take part in a special festival. It takes place over several days in the fall. Dancers in bright and colorful masks perform a series of 16 dances. The dances show how Buddhism was first brought to Tibet. The Sherpas are known to be very welcoming and happy people. Because of their strength and stamina, they are an essential part of any climb on Everest. It is through recent mountain climbing trips that many Westerners have come to know the Sherpas. Chapter 3: The Discovery of Everest. Before the mid-1800s, hardly anyone in the Western world knew that Mount Everest even existed. Europeans and Asians traded goods with one another. However, the Himalayas were so high and rugged that all the trade routes went around the mountains rather than over them, and Mount Everest, standing in the center of the mountain range, was too remote to be discovered. India had been trading spices such as black pepper, nutmeg, ginger, and cinnamon with Europe since ancient times. Then in the late 1400s, the Ottoman Empire in modern-day Turkey blocked land routes from Europe to Asia, so Europeans had to go by sea. Nothing would stop the spice trade. The British arrived in India in 1612 and began to set up trading posts. By the late 1700s, they controlled much of India. In 1800, they decided to map the whole region. They wanted to know exactly where places were on this part of the globe and the distances between them. So in 1802, a great mapping project of India began. Thousands of distances and angles were measured across India. In 1818, a young man named George Everest was hired to assist William Lambton as the Surveyor General of India. A surveyor's job is to take measurements of land. After Lambton died, Everest was put in charge in 1830. George Everest faced many obstacles. The instruments used for surveying were enormous. Some weighed more than 1,000 pounds. They had to be carried by 12 or more men or by elephants. Heavy monsoon rains flooded rivers and obscured views, so Everest had to construct great brick towers, some as high as 50 feet, from which to make his observations. Survey teams worked in jungles full of tigers, boa constrictors, and scorpions. If the animals didn't get to the men, fever did. Many died, and more than once Everest himself caught malaria and had to leave India to recover. While away from India, Everest worked to improve equipment. When he returned, he organized a team that included up to 700 men, dozens of camels and horses, and 4 elephants. Progress was slow but steady. By 1843, when Everest retired, the survey had mapped India from its southern tip all the way to the Himalayas. In 1847, George Everest's successor, Andrew Waugh, continued surveying the southern edge of the Himalayas. It was then that Waugh spotted a mountain he suspected to be the tallest in the world. It took years before he could find out for sure. Most of the year, the top of Peak 15, as it was known at the time, was covered by clouds. The mountain also lay over the border in Nepal. The Nepalese government didn't trust the British and would not allow them to enter the country. Waugh and his team had to make their observations from afar. The closest they got to Peak 15 was 108 miles away. The information from 5 different places was given to human computers. These were mathematicians who would carefully crunch the numbers to determine the height of the mountain. Finally, in 1856, Peak 15 was determined to be the tallest in the world. At the time, it was said to be 29,002 feet above sea level. There is some argument today as to the exact height. Some say 29,028 feet. Some say 29,035. I think it's a little taller now. It keeps growing. But these 19th century human computers were only about 0.1% off from Peak 15's true height. It was now more than 10 years since George Everest had retired as a Surveyor General. Still, Waugh decided to name the mountain after him. In 1865, 1 year before Everest's death, the Royal Geographic Society accepted Waugh's suggestion. Peak 15 was now Mount Everest. Now, this is the best part of this book. I think I'm going to read this box. It says, "What's in a name?" George Everest did not want the mountain named after him. Why? Because during the Great Mapping Project, it had been common practice to use only names that the local people would use. The Nepalese on Peak 15's south slope called their mountain Sagarmatha, or Sky Goddess, and the Tibetans to the north, as well as the Sherpas in Nepal's Khumbu Valley, knew it as their mother goddess Chomolungma. George Everest respected these old names. It was for this reason that he did not wish Peak 15 to be named after him. He also argued that Everest could not be written in Hindi, a native language of the area, nor could the Indian people even pronounce the name. And this is the kicker. Its pronunciation has changed over time. George's name is actually pronounced Everest. What? It's actually Mount Everest. But because there was no internet or anything back then that would tell people how it was pronounced, everyone sees the name and they go Everest. And that's the name that stuck, even though that's not how his name was pronounced. Losing my mind over that fact. Imagine that you go down in history with your name mispronounced. Absolutely wild. But continuing on. By this point in world history, much of the globe, the Americas, Australia, the South Pacific, had been explored and mapped. With no continents remaining to be discovered, explorers now tried to be the first to reach remote places. In 1909, 44 years after Mount Everest was given its name, American explorer Robert Peary reached the North Pole. 2 years later, Roald Amundsen and his team from Norway made it to the South Pole. It seemed only logical that Mount Everest, sometimes called the Earth's third pole, should come next, and the British wanted the honor of climbing it first. At this time, the Kingdom of Nepal was closed to outsiders. That meant an approach had to be made from the north in Tibet. Tibet, however, did not welcome foreign visitors either. British diplomats decided to appeal to the Dalai Lama, the leader of Tibet. He gave permission to enter in 1921. A British team was formed, Leaving from India, they hiked more than 400 miles into the Himalayas. For months, the team searched the valleys and glaciers along the northern and eastern sides of Mount Everest. They were hoping to find a route to the summit. Chapter 4. George Mallory. Among those on the first expedition to Everest in 1921 was a man named George Herbert Lee Mallory, a handsome 35-year-old teacher from England. He was also an experienced mountaineer. 10 years earlier, he had climbed Mont Blanc, the tallest mountain in the Alps. Mallory was also the man who once said he wanted to climb Everest because it's there. He was part of the first 3 expeditions to the mountain. A dozen or so Sherpas were hired to assist the British. The Sherpas did not understand why the men wanted to reach the summit of Mount Everest. In their native language, there was not even a word for summit. Mallory wrote to his wife that the mountaineers were walking off the map. They were climbing where no one had ever had before. They wore many layers of clothing made from wool and silk to fight the bitter cold. Their leather boots had nails on them for gripping the icy ground. For months, they explored the land around Everest. They climbed as high as 23,030 feet. That was higher than anyone had ever climbed before. They also produced the first good maps of the area. Violent storms and exhaustion forced an end to the expedition, but they discovered one very important thing: a route to the top. The next year, in 1922, a new British team was formed. With maps from the first expedition in hand, they tried 3 times to reach the summit. The first attempt nearly ended in disaster. One climber fell, pulling over 2 others, and they began to slide down a steep slope. Mallory was able to keep them from falling using his rope and ice axe. On the second summit push, climbers reached more than 27,000 feet, but eventually the group turned back. They were simply too exhausted to continue. Mallory led the final charge for the summit. It was June, and early snows had begun to fall. He and 2 British teammates, with 14 Sherpas behind them, trudged through the waist-deep snow. Suddenly, an avalanche surged down the mountain. Mallory and his teammates were buried. Even so, they were able to dig themselves out. However, 9 of the Sherpas were swept into a deep crack or crevasse. Only 2 survived. Mallory was terribly upset. He blamed himself for the tragedy. The third expedition to Everest in 1924 would be Mallory's last. A freak storm plunged temperatures to nearly 40 degrees below zero. That's cold enough to freeze human skin within minutes. Mallory wrote to his wife that the trip had been a bad time altogether. He said he was looking out of a tent door onto a world of snow and vanishing hopes. On the morning of June 8th, Mallory set off for the summit with Andrew Irvine. He was Mallory's 22-year-old climbing partner. They were last spotted at 12:50 in the afternoon, 2 small black dots nearing the top of the mountain. Suddenly, clouds blew in and covered them. It was as if they had disappeared. Shortly after, a snowstorm kicked up. It became clear after a few days that both men had died. It took almost 75 years before Mallory's frozen body was discovered. It is believed that he fell to his death while roped to Andrew Irvine. However, his partner's body has never been found. Some believe Mallory may have reached the summit of Mount Everest before his death, but no one can know for sure. Chapter 5. The Swiss Take a Turn. After the tragedies of 1922 and 1924, the Dalai Lama decided to close Tibet's borders again. No further attempts were allowed on Everest for nearly a decade. The British goal of reaching the summit did not die, however. In the 1930s, airplanes were able to fly around the mountain, revealing more possible routes. In 1933, Frank Smith attempted to reach the summit alone. He reached an altitude of 28,200 feet before turning around due to fatigue. Smith said that while climbing he saw mirages. A mirage is when you see something and your mind thinks it's real, but it's not. In In Smith's Mirage, he had a climbing partner with him, and the two were connected by a rope. He thought that if he slipped, his friend would save him. Smith also thought he saw two dark objects floating in the sky. One, he said, looked like a kite balloon. The other looked like it had small wings and a beak. They both appeared to vibrate, he said, before vanishing behind some clouds. Was any of this real? There's no way to know. No, it was not. Due to illness, accidents, and poor weather conditions, other expeditions in the 1930s, all by British teams, failed to reach the top. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, attempts to climb Everest were put on hold. After the war, the Chinese government took over Tibet and closed the region's borders. Approaching Mount Everest from the north was no longer an option. Around this same time, India became independent from Great Britain. With the British gone, Nepal finally opened its borders. A southern approach to the summit was now possible, but it meant being brave enough to climb the treacherous Khumbu icefall. There's the Khumbu icefall. I guess we'll read about it. Why not? It says the Khumbu icefall sits at the top of the Khumbu Glacier, which is the highest glacier in the world. A glacier is a slow-moving area of ice, and an icefall, like a waterfall, is where this frozen water falls down a wall of rocks. The Khumbu icefall moves down the slopes of Everest as much as 4 feet deep every day, or 4 feet every day. As it moves, it opens up wide, deep crevasses. It also breaks the glacial ice into towering seracs. Seracs are apartment building-sized blocks of ice that can crash down without warning. The deadly accident on April 18, 2014 was a result of a falling serac. On his first trip to Everest in 1921, George Mallory spotted the Khumbu icefall from afar. He said it looked terribly steep and broken. Mallory considered it impossible to climb, but it was through the icefall that the first successful trip to the summit, and many to follow, was taken. Spoilers. We're not going to read about the Yeti. Oh my gosh. In 1951, a British team nearly made it through the icefall before a 100-foot wide crevasse put an end to the climb. The next year, the Nepalese government let a Swiss group go up the mountain. They climbed the Khumbu icefall in 5 days. The team went down 60 feet into the crevasse that had stopped the British the year before. They found a snow bridge partway across, then installed a shaky rope ladder to complete the trip to the other side. There it is. Looks like a moraine, but I guess it's an icefall. That's pretty cool. After crossing the icefall, the Swiss entered the Western Khum. The Khum is a deep, bowl-shaped valley. The Western Khum, sometimes called the Valley of Silence, is surrounded by snow-covered mountainsides. When sunlight reflects off the white snow on windless days, temperatures can climb as high as 95 degrees. That wild. That's like almost 40 Celsius. Is that crazy? Next for the Swiss came the Lhotse face, the 4th tallest mountain in the world. Lhotse is connected to Everest by a high rocky field called the South Col. From the South Col, a Sherpa and the Swiss leader made a push for Everest's summit. They went along Everest's southeast ridge. They set a climbing record for 28,199 feet. That was when their oxygen tank stopped working. There was no choice but to turn around just short of the top. In 31 years, no one had reached the top of Mount Everest. Getting there always seemed beyond reach, but the next year, 1953, everything changed. Chapter 6, Hillary and Tenzing. In 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay grabbed the prize. They became the first men to reach the summit of Everest. Although they came from very different places, they became trusted friends and partners. Edmund Hillary was born in Auckland, New Zealand on July 20th, 1919. When he was 16, Edmund went on a field trip to the tallest mountain on New Zealand's North Island. Though he was uncoordinated, Edmund discovered that he was stronger than his companions. Mountain climbing became a lifelong hobby. Hillary served in the Royal New Zealand Air Force during World War II and raised bees for a living with his brother Rex. Tenzing Norgay was born in May 1914 in the Khumbu Valley. The 11th of 13 children, Tenzing grew up in the shadow of Mount Everest in the village of Tengboche. He was sent to the famous Tengboche monastery to become a monk, but Tenzing decided that wasn't for him. When he was 20, Tenzing joined an expedition to Everest as a porter. A porter's job is to carry supplies up and down the mountain. He joined other climbs during the 1930s. In time, Tenzing became the most trusted Sherpa guide on Everest. 33-year-old Edmund Hillary and 39-year-old Tenzing Norgay joined the 1953 British expedition to Everest. It was a massive operation. 10 tons of food and equipment were carried by more than 350 porters, 20 guides, and 10 climbers. Tenzing was the leader of the Sherpa guides. It was his 7th trip up the mountain. Not everyone in the group would try to reach the summit. John Hunt, the expedition leader, had to see how everyone performed first. In the end, he chose 2 pairs of climbers to make the final trip. Small teams of Sherpas and support climbers would carry supplies up the mountain. They would help the summit climbers set up their camps before returning to lower altitudes to sleep at their own camps. The expedition went through the Icefall and the Western Khumbu. The men climbed up the Lhotse face to the South Col. From there, Tom Bourdillon and Charles Evans, the first pair, attempted a summit push on May 26th. They reached the south summit at 28,750 feet. They were less than 300 feet from the tip top of the mountain, but their oxygen tanks were acting up, and the men were exhausted. Bourdillon and Evans returned to camp, defeated but alive. 3 days later, a second pair of climbers, Hillary and Tenzing, tried to reach the top. After a cold and windy night camped at 27,900 feet, they awoke at 4 in the morning. The day was clear. Tenzing whooped in delight when he spotted Tengboche Monastery miles below. For Tenzing, that was a good sign from the gods. Tenzing and Hillary ate a breakfast of sardines on crackers. They also drank plenty of lemon juice with sugar to fight off weakness. Hillary's boots had gotten wet the day before and were frozen solid. For 2 hours he cooked the boots over their campfire, drying them and softening up the leather. Pardon me. At 6:30 they set out wearing heavy parkas, breathing masks, and 30 pounds of oxygen gear. Tenzing wore boots made of reindeer fur. They hiked to the south summit, where their friends had to turn around days earlier. The two made good time. They continued to the Corniche Traverse, a frightening path of rock and snow. Using ice axes, Hillary and Tenzing cut away footholds to walk in. One careful step at a time, the two crossed the narrow knife edge of snow. Any misstep to the left or right would send them falling to their deaths 1.5 miles below. Suddenly they came to a 40-foot-high wall of rock and snow. The rock was smooth and appeared to have no footholds. How could they get up it? All at once Hillary spotted ice running along a crack in the rock. He backed his body into the crack. Then he kicked backward, sinking the spiky metal teeth on the bottom of his boots, called crampons, into the ice behind him. Bit by bit, using his crampons, he worked his way up the rock. After reaching the top, Edmund lay on his back to catch his breath. He helped pull Tenzing Norgay up the rock. Finally, the summit was within sight. The two men walked another couple hundred feet on the snowy dome. At 11:30 in the morning on May 29th, 1953, the summit of Mount Everest was reached. Overjoyed, the men hugged each other. Holding the flags of Great Britain, Nepal, India, and the United Nations, Tenzing Norgay posed for a picture. But there is little time for celebration. They were running low on oxygen. Tenzing buried an offering of crackers and sweets to the gods. Hillary placed a cross in the snow. After just 15 minutes on top of the world, the two began their descent. News of Hillary and Tenzing's success reached Great Britain a few days later, on June 2nd. It was the same day Elizabeth II was crowned Queen of England. It was a day of true excitement and celebration. The media called the conquering of Mount Everest a gift for the new monarch. For his achievements, Tenzing Norgay was awarded medals by the Queen and by the nations of India and Nepal. He was treated as a god among his people. Later on, he went on to start a mountain climbing company. In 1996, 10 years after his death, Tenzing's son, Chumling, followed in his father's footsteps and reached the top of Everest. Edmund was knighted by the new queen. That meant from then on he was known as Sir Edmund Hillary. Having conquered the Earth's third pole, he later went on to reach both the North and South Poles. He was the first man in the world to reach both poles and summit Everest. In 1990, his son Peter climbed Mount Everest, making them the first father and son to achieve the summit. Edmund dedicated his life to improving the lives of the Sherpa people. He built schools, clinics, and hospitals. He became known as the godfather of Khumbu. Let's read this too. Everest expeditions since 1953. The first Americans to reach the summit of Everest did so in 1963. James Whittaker with Sherpa Nawang Khumbu reached the summit on May 1st, following the path of Hillary and Tenzing. 3 weeks later, Willie Unsold and Tom Hornbean also followed that path, climbing through the icefall to the western Khumbu. But rather than climb the Lhotse face, they climbed to the western ridge. This was much more difficult path to take, but they were the first to do it. Junko Tabe of Japan became the first woman to climb Everest in 1975. In 1978, an Italian and an Austrian were the first to climb without oxygen tanks. How is that possible? Oh my gosh. And in 1980, a Polish team was the first to reach the top during the winter time. Wow. They faced winds of 100 miles per hour and temperatures close to 50 degrees below zero. In 1970, Yuichiro Miura became the first man to ski down Mount Everest. Miura skied more than 6,500 feet down the mountain, then fell for 1,300 feet along the rocky Lhotse face. He used a large parachute to slow his descent and stopped just 250 feet from the edge of a crevasse. A film about him, The Man Who Skied Down Everest, won an Academy Award. Chapter 7, The Death Zone. Falling ice and avalanches are not the only risks when climbing Mount Everest. Climbing at high altitudes can have dangerous, even deadly effects on the human body. The higher up the mountain, the harder it becomes to breathe. That's because oxygen is more scattered, more spread out. A person near the top of Everest breathes in only about a third as much oxygen as they would at sea level. The air is so thin that the body must fight for every bit of oxygen it can get. The less oxygen the body receives, the more dangerous climbing becomes. Above the Khumbu icefall and the western Khumbu, 26,000 feet up, lies Mount Everest's death zone. In the death zone, the air is so thin that unless climbers breathe from oxygen tanks, most will faint within minutes. Some even die. Nothing can survive for too long in the death zone. Even below the death zone, climbers can experience a danger known as altitude sickness. Symptoms include headache, loss of appetite, nausea, irritability, and dizziness. In more serious cases, fluid fills the lungs and makes a person cough up bubbly pink mucus. In the worst form of altitude sickness, the brain swells with fluid. This can lead to vomiting and blindness. Parts of the body can become paralyzed. Climbers become confused, forgetting where they are and the dangers they face. Some people have been known to remove their oxygen tanks or layers of protective clothing, or even wander off alone, never to be seen again. Climbers with severe altitude sickness must be brought down to lower elevations. If they are not treated right away, they may die. But rescue operations are difficult on Everest. Helicopters can fly only in good weather. Also, the air is so thin that the helicopter blades have little to grab onto. Landing a helicopter on Everest is dangerous. The most severe weather on Everest can also be a killer. Exposure to extreme cold and wind can lower the body's temperature to dangerous levels where the heart and lungs can no longer work. occurs when a person's skin is exposed to extremely cold air. The blood vessels around the exposed skin shrink. When this happens, blood can no longer flow to the area. Frostbite most often hits the fingers, nose, ears, and toes. The frozen skin goes numb and sometimes dies. The skin hardens and turns black. In bad cases of frostbite, toes or fingers must be amputated or cut off. Chapter 8, Mount Everest Today. Climbing Mount Everest today is very different from the days of George Mallory and Edmund Hillary. Before 1951, Nepal, Tibet, and China allowed only one expedition to climb the mountain every year. Even after 1951, the number of climbers was strictly limited. But people around the world wanted to follow in Hillary's and Tenzing's footsteps. In time, Nepal and China let anybody try who had the money. Every year since 1998, more than 100 people have reached the top of Everest. In 2000, it was 145 people. By 2010, it was 536. This has led to deadly traffic jams on the mountain. In 1996, 8 people died when a blizzard suddenly appeared on the summit. Among them was a famous guide named Rob Hall. At the time, he had climbed Everest more times than any non-Sherpa in the world. 7 more would die on the mountain that season. On May 18th, 2012, 200 climbers, accompanied by more than 200 guides, attempted to reach the summit on the same day. Look at the traffic jam. A storm was due the next day, so everyone tried to reach the summit early. With only one route up to the top, people stood single file for hours, shivering and suffering from altitude sickness. In the end, 234 reached the top, but 4 people died. All the trash that gets left up there, so sad. Although climbing Everest is by no means easy, lighter equipment, better weather forecasting, and experienced Sherpas have increased the odds of reaching the summit. In 1990, only 18% of summit attempts were successful. By 2013, it was 64%. People as young as 13 and as old as 80 have made it to the top. This is Malavat Purnia, climbed when she was 13. Climbers today follow a fixed route, holding ropes that are set in place before the climb starts. They cross the crevasses of the Khumbu icefall on sturdy aluminum ladders. These ropes and ladders are installed early in the season by Sherpas. The Sherpas who died on the Khumbu icefall in 2014 were on the mountain early in the season, setting the course for that year's climbers. There is little chance that traffic on Mount Everest will slow down. Nepal charges $25,000 for a permit to climb the mountain. For such a poor country, this money is sorely needed. After paying for a permit, people who wish to climb Everest often hire guides and Sherpas. Climbers spend anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000 in their attempts to reach the top. The Sherpa community relies on this money. A Sherpa guide can expect to make between $2,000 and $8,000 in one season. With most people in Nepal making $600 or $700 a year, this is a huge sum. The money makes it worth the risks, and the risks are many. Because the Sherpas carry supplies to and from camps along the slopes, they cross the Khumbu icefall dozens of times every season. This increases the chances of deadly accidents. After the horrible day in April 2014, the Nepalese government offered each of the victims' families only $400. This small amount made the Sherpa community furious. They went on strike, ending the climbing season for the year. Despite the dangers and the Sherpa strike of 2014, people continue to visit Mount Everest. Since ancient times, humans have pushed themselves to the limit, to the ends of the earth. We looked at the sea and imagined faraway lands full of riches. We built great ships, crossing thousands of miles of ocean to reach every corner of the globe. We gazed at the sky and became determined to reach the moon. By the time Edmund Hillary and Tenzing climbed Everest, scientists in the United States and Russia were already planning travel into space. But while Neil Armstrong walked on the moon just 16 years later in 1969. It was two men, a beekeeper from New Zealand and a Sherpa from Nepal, who first stood on the earth from above, high atop Chomolungma, mother goddess of the world. And that's the end of our book tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video to be relaxing and educational, and if you're still awake, let me know if you enjoyed the little map portion. I could try to integrate this more into my videos. I don't know how, but I can try. Let me know. Anyway, I hope you found this video to be relaxing and educational,